Who else is with you?
I said go! You're okay. You're okay. You're okay.
Benji Carver here. So excited this morning, I guess it is morning now, to be with you with a local filmmaker, and on top of that, a genre filmmaker, specifically from Mitchell Street's Pictures. And I mean genre in the sense of it's horror, but it's also there's a lot more going on than just that in his films. And was very excited to have this as another Hole in the Head 2020 here at the festival. The short is Vincent Cortez's short film, The Lost. And please welcome Vincent Cortez, everybody, from Mitchell Street Pictures. Yay!
Thank you for having me.
So Vincent, I think what's a lot of things to talk about here. It's interesting is that I've mentioned before, we have another short film that has kind of a similar questions, has parents directing their own kids as well. But the interesting thing is, your film is about paternal, kind of paternalism, patriarchy, questions of that. Well, the other film it was about a mother who was infected as well. Kind of maybe guide us through this a little bit of how The Lost, because I mean you mentioned a lot about paternal storytelling and questions in Another Hole in the Head, and kind of that was the inspiration for this film as well as what is The Lost on top of that.
Yeah. I think The Lost is certainly a story that was born out of dealing with the death of a loved one, the passing of my paternal grandfather, and also sort of dealing with the trauma that we sort of see in systematic violence, and kind of marrying those two anchors with this idea of sacrifice. And specifically from my vantage point, it was the sacrifices that were made by my grandfather, the grandfather who passed away in 2018. Seeing these, immersing myself in his story more and kind of dealing with his loss, and really learning about him being a 14-year-old going from this rural area in the South area region of Mexico, going to Mexico City as a 14-year-old to basically learn to become a mechanic on his own, having grown up on a farm, and then coming to the United States and basically working the railroads of West Oakland when there were really no or very light sort of labor laws, so literally backbreaking labor, so kind of seeing that and hearing more about it, more than I ever had in my life. So those are the influences, I would say, thematically, but the guts, if you will, of the story is basically two children surviving in the aftermath of a viral apocalyptic sort of scenario, right? Zombies, sort of the collapse of society, the collapse of order. And it's these two resilient children trying to find some hope and kind of living in a routine, I would say. Because I think with apocalyptic stories, it's really, we lose our sense of normalcy, right? Everything that we depend on or that we rely on to live our lives has collapsed or is broken or is corrupted in some way, shape, or form. And so here are these two children, these two sisters who have a version of their family that still exists, and they're just trying to do something to kind of maintain hope, but they're sort of running out, right? It's kind of, you're not sure if they're at the end of their rope, And so I'd say all of those elements really form The Lost. And in terms of the paternal side of it, what's interesting is that the root of this idea, just from a sense of like an atmosphere or like a vibe, was years and years ago, I was working on another project, helping a friend produce a feature, and I had the task of holding the grip and lighting truck, like just housing it for a little less than a month. And there was one weekend where we weren't shooting, and I was like, we have all this gear. We should go and shoot something on the day off, right? We should go and shoot something. And the instant thing that came to my mind was two children, with their infected mother, actually, like a zombified mother.
Yeah.
And it's really because at that time I knew I had access to two children actors, a young boy, and a young girl, and I knew I had an actress that I had worked with a lot. And I was like, I know they would come together. They've already said they'd be down to do it. What could I do? And so it was basically this idea of children in a kind of a cavernous, basement or some sort of a desolate warehouse, and they would go in there, and the whole story was just them feeding this loved one that they have, shackled up, chained up. And that was it was just this interaction. And I tried to put it together, but I think it was just too much of a stretch, because it was a little bit too last minute. And so it never happened, but that visual stayed in my head. That visual was just kind of etched somewhere in the back of my head. There was something about it that, as that time, as a father, as a young father myself, there was just something that drew me to it. And then as time progressed in life, you live life, and like I said, I lost my grandfather on my father's side, and just my children were growing, and my wife and I, as parents, we begin to make those types of sacrifices, right? Not, sometimes they could be small, sometimes they're big things, but as a parent, you begin to make these sacrifices. And so I think just as time progressed and things lined up and the loss really took shape, I should also say that there was a short film that I did my last year of college at San Francisco State. So I think I saw somewhere that you're a Gator. So uh, I made a zombie film, and it was called Remnants of the Lost. And so it very much is a kind of a sister story to The Lost, I would say. But it was the filmmaker that I was at that age, in my early 20s, and not necessarily yet being a parent myself, and having just recently gotten married at that time. So it deals with a very similar setup, except with a husband and wife and an orphaned child, and it's very much a similar story in certain regards. But the thing is that at that time, while I'm proud of that film, and as I said, it's the film I made at that age, and with that level of experience at that time, it's also one of those things where, having lived life, I'm able to put more emotion into it, because I think to me, that's the heart of the film, The Lost, is the dynamic between the children and the parents, and that connection, right? Specifically in our case, the father. So yeah, I mean, I think there's so many components and so many experiences that have helped me get to this point of making The Lost.
Well, I think it's something great, and I think also your look of your film. I love how you chose to shoot in darks and shadows, more so. And again, I don't mean to contrast your film with another film, but just sort of the similarities we have at the festival. Their film is like very bright, almost, in some ways I say it's almost too bright in some ways. But what I love, and it takes place in the suburbs. It's that setting, and this to me is like, yeah, this is way more like post-apocalyptic, children kind of on their last end kind of thing. And it's interesting you mentioned about post-apocalyptic, because this is something I wanted to talk about with you, particularly because of how you chose your actors, but you yourself being Latinx filmmaker as well. My studies at San Francisco State were American Indian Studies and cinema, and that is my grandfather's journey. It's a documentary I made for my senior thesis about him in Vietnam and being Native American, but not identifying and whatnot from his journey. So I thought there was a lot going on with your short that's like, oh, we're in the same region of storytelling, and this question of familial or paternal connections that are going on. And also on top of it is sort of the studies with American Indian Studies, AIS, is with cinema. The filmmaker Jeff Barnaby, who did Blood Quantum recently. Have you seen Blood Quantum?
I have not seen Blood Quantum.
It's an amazing film. The concept on its own is about primarily the Mi'kmaq First Nations in Canada. A virus breaks out or something's going on, like instantly, like the fish are coming back to life and stuff. At first it might seem goofy for a second, but it's very serious. It's almost like a John Carpenter film always. But what happens is that this particular native nation is immune to whatever is the virus, and of course all the white people, all the all the Canadians essentially, they don't specifically say it's Canada, but it's like they are all infected, and so they become kind of it's the flip of society kind of thing. But what Barnaby kind of talked about when the film was first released, primarily it was released last year in festivals and then became very prevalent. It was released right when quarantine happened. Is he talks about and essentially filmmaking, especially from an indigenous standpoint, it's post-apocalyptic. Yeah, post-apocalyptic, it begins in 1890. That's when normalcy in itself for Native people it's gone and stuff like that. That's officially it. So that's kind of his basis. And then also on top of his childhood of a documentary called Incident at Ratagush that he experienced, where the Canadian government raided his people's houses and stuff like that, and they were all displaced as well. So I thought that was interesting, like dynamic that's going on between your film, my film, his film, and stuff like that, and sort of cool. Especially how these stories didn't start in 2020, but they've been around universally for, with our ancestors for thousands of years, but particularly we're examining, I think, a lot of the last 100 years in general. So I think that's something that I thought, that's why I was like, oh, I want to have a longer conversation. I just can't.
Yeah. And I felt that too. And I appreciate that. I think it's, I love, I remember seeing the trailers for that film and just being like, oh, that sounds awesome. Yeah. And I think that it's interesting to put it in that perspective of the sense of, well, post-apocalyptic for some folks could have happened generations ago, right? Mm-hmm. And how are people surviving? I think that's there's a writer, Josefina Lopez, a Latina writer, a playwright, that I had an opportunity to connect with some years ago, and we were sharing a cup of coffee and talking, and I was talking about post-apocalyptic stories with her. Mm-hmm. And she said something that really made me kind of check myself. And she was like, you usually see these post-apocalyptic stories where it's like really extreme, the volume is really up, and it's in this direction or that direction, but the volume is just cranked up. She's like, but if you think about some homeless folks, the unhoused folks, mm-hmm. they're living a post-apocalyptic life, right across the street from somebody who might be on their computer drinking a latte and doing this and doing that. So it's you got to kind of anchor everything in the perspective of the individual that's sort of surviving or trying to survive, if you will. And so that really stuck with me. And I would say that definitely kind of influenced the kind of the perspective that we took in The Lost. The perspective in the story, as you know, it's from the perspective of these children, and so we made a very conscious choice of limiting what you saw of the world that actually surrounds them, right? The collapsing cities, or the gigantic wall that prevents the infected from breaching, or whatever it could be. Mm-hmm. We didn't really want to do that traditional thing of just showing that, even if it's like an establishing shot and then we don't ever see it again, because we liked the idea of there's this what feels like sort of a hand painted mural or art piece that's in the room of the two main characters. And it shows sort of a child's interpretation, a crude child's painting of like an army of zombies and like a few soldiers and a fence and a burned city and a helicopter. And so you see that a few times maybe once in detail, but in other times it's just kind of a background piece. And like for us, that was it. That was the key. It was like, let's limit what the viewer can see from a traditional standpoint and just allow it to go through the perspective of the children.
Mm.
And in terms of the aesthetics, you know, we loved the feeling of this kind of natural light but very dim kind of world. When you get to see the zombie or the, you know, the infected father, as I called him in the script, there's a lot of candlelight because, you know, the children are attempting something in that routine I mentioned. They're attempting something. Part of their routine is to try to create this ability to reconnect with that loved one. And so there's the altar, right? The altar that is there, that has significance to them. The candles there, or they try to keep it burning all the time. You know, there's a hope for them that there's some way to break through, you know. And I don't want to say too much just if
Yeah.
people haven't seen it, but
Yeah.
there is that component of keeping it rooted in their perspective, because for them it could be the end of the world, right? All they have is each other. The two sisters have each other, but they still feel like they have their family.
Mhm.
Even if the family is not present in the way that you and I are talking to each other now, there still is something there that they're holding on to, you know, desperately holding on to it, but they're holding on to it.
Yeah. And I think also, just not to reveal too much again, but is that you mentioned also an extra character that comes in and an action that they take, that the George Floyd murder happened at the exact same time you premiered your film.
Yeah. So
uh,
yeah, or go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't
oh
mean
no,
to
that was
jump
my
in.
when you
Yeah.
mentioned that in the comments, I was like, oh, I gotta bring that up at some point, just sort of like the timing of it, because you made this about a year before. But even though it's something like, if you know police procedurals, I mean, from cuffing people like too hard to, you know, kind of get a confessional, to the knee to the next, to there's
Right.
many other
Yes.
tactics that they use, and particularly border patrol agents, which is a project I've been working on the various, you know, various crimes against atrocities that against humanity and stuff like that. And so but it's interesting that you just, your timing to pick that particular incident, like, was that something that, why did you choose that, and then also just sort of your timing with that?
Yeah. So I'll kind of lead into it, you know, and I had sort of mentioned systematic violence at
Yeah.
the onset of us talking. And so, you know, one of the things that I remember hearing is these recordings of children just crying, terrified crying, being separated at the southern border from their parents or their loved ones. And so again, while I was processing the death of my grandfather, who was an immigrant and who went through this as a young person, just coming to this country, to the United States, I'm hearing that. And so, you know, when I thought about the antagonist, and see, that's the thing for me, when I thought about the antagonist for The Lost, there was this idea of, okay, let's just kind of, maybe it's just some sort of a scavenger that could be an antagonistic character, and he just wants to take the belongings of these children. And a lot of that I had seen, and the one thing that I kept coming back to was, wait a minute, if part of this is talking about the immigrant experience and finding asylum and safety and like hope in a new place, then the villain needs to represent some kind of a systematic agent that will not allow them to exist to find that peace. But at the same time, they're doing it because it's just part of doing their job. So bringing us to someone who comes in who may not even feel that they're doing something terrible or something harmful, this character sort of comes in and turns this small bit of sanctuary or peace that our characters have, that turns it upside down and is now threatening, is sort of threatening everything that they sort of hold sacred right now in their survival. And so yes, like, having this character come in and just doing their job, but also endangering the life of, you know, the protagonist, specifically the older sister. And what was interesting was, yes, so we shot this film at the beginning of 2019. And obviously a virus, you know, viral apocalyptic sort of scenario, but this idea that systematic violence, as you were alluding to, you know, systematic violence has been a part of society for or various societies for a very long time. And so one of the things, and there were various incarnations of the actual more intimate interaction, the struggle, if you will, between this agent and between our characters. And it was interesting because in the process of choreographing, so Steve Lee is a local actor who played the agent. He's in San Francisco. And when we were choreographing what that violence actually is going to end up looking like, what was interesting was it turned into, it's dark, you're in an unknown area, you're trying to keep yourself safe so you could go back to the people that matter to you, right? Because you're doing your job. And if there's this hectic sort of moment, the easiest thing for you to do would be to try to kneel on someone's neck, knowing that you're going to try to cuff them. But the thing is that this is a child. So even if you're in the dark and you're not intending to kill anyone, the fact that you're doing these things that are taught to you, it could be endangering a child's life. And so when we shot those things, it felt really intense. You know, there's close-ups of the sister trying to breathe, and there's all these things happening. And for us, it was this thing of never wanting to just say, here's this horrible villainous character. It was, yes, he's an antagonist, but we liked leaving a bit of it up to the viewer. I've actually had people watch it and they're like, when the sort of the comeuppance of that agent happens on screen, they're like, oh yeah, you know, like I was like, wow, you know, that guy was terrible.
Yeah.
But I've had other people watch it and go, I felt kind of bad because it seemed like he was just trying to do his job. Like maybe he could have helped them, or maybe this, or maybe that. But it's like, you know, I like leaving it open for the viewer to sort of bring their experience into it. And so, yes, that happens in our film, right? The knee to the neck, this moment of possibly losing life. And we premiered it the week of the video of George Floyd's killing being released. And so I just remember seeing the video myself, and I'd say like most people feeling this kind of visceral gut punch and this like, you know, squeezing, compressing of your heart. But it's almost like, you know, of all the videos that we have seen of people, disenfranchised people being murdered, sometimes at the hands of law enforcement, sometimes not, or kind of murdered at the hands of like militia, vigilante sort of violence.
Yeah.
Right. It just felt like the fact that the action was the exact same thing that we had in our film while we're in the middle ourselves collectively of a pandemic. It felt heavy, but at the same time, it felt like our intention, like the intentions in our hearts and our minds that we've had with this story, that now was the time to get this kind of a story out there. Right.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the powerfulness. Also, this person that has, you know, the performance, it's your two daughters also on top of this as well. So I think there's an added emotion that's just there, you know, on a parental human level.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think that's something that's also, but also, yeah, talk about a little bit like about your kids and how they came to this piece with you and directing them and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, we had, you know, we've been working as a family for quite some time on projects. I mean, there's a sci-fi film that we made some years ago called Romero that is very much an apocalyptic sort of story. And my oldest child, Val, you know, at that time, she was about, I think, turning 2 years old. And so while Val's role in that film is on screen, it's, you see the character a few times, but the character's significance to the story is very important. It's basically a child that may hold the cure to a virus, so to speak, right? And so, and Sophia, my co-producer, my partner, my wife, we've been creating stories together since we met. And so, it just made sense that as we had children and we grew our family, that they sort of became a part of it because they grew up around it. They grew up around us filming projects and doing things. And so, when we had written the script of The Lost, I remember I said, I want to read the script to them, and the short film script to them. And I'm going to ask them if they want to do it, because if they don't want to do it, I know that it's going to be demanding. It's going to be demanding. And at that point, they've been in little things, they've been in little films, and they've had, small to slightly sizable roles in some of these stories. But this is them. This is all them for, X amount of screen time. It's them really carrying the story together. And I read it to them, and they were interested in doing it. I think my youngest daughter just wasn't aware of how much work it was going to be. I know it was hard for her. She definitely had fun, and she loved just having so many friendly people around and just that kind of environment. But it was very demanding, and I really just allowed them to be who they were naturally. They are very close. They play with each other a lot. And so I knew that by just kind of creating the scenario for them and then letting them kind of naturally play in that space and kind of embody these characters, that there was going to be something there. One of my favorite little moments in the story is, again, in the midst of this kind of chaotic uncertainty, it's just a moment of like the big sister cleaning the little sister's face. And just this little, and then she kind of boops her on the nose with like the cleaning cloth, and like just that little moment in there, I thought it really sets up, again, naturally who children tend to be, right? Like children tend to be very open to connecting and very empathetic, and what happens, I think, as we grow up, we sort of like the world kind of punches us and society hits us, and then we build these walls and we kind of find ways of protecting ourselves, and we sometimes, we really do this, we sometimes kind of disconnect that empathetic part of ourselves, right? And so I just thought that these were the perfect characters, and obviously my connection and the love I have with my children, it to be able to put that on screen, it just made it more real. As you were saying, it made it more raw for me. So I think there were plenty of times in the process of filming, especially near the climax of the movie, where it was very emotional for me. And I try to give them room to push themselves, but push themselves safely, and feeling like, okay, I'm with my parents and I'm safe and I'm, protected, so to speak. And so I liked that opportunity. It was definitely challenging, but I feel like they really, they brought it to life more than I ever could have asked them to.
And was that little moment that when she's cleaning her face, was that scripted, or was that just something you kind of found?
It was something that was not scripted in that way. It was just, you see in the script, it just talks about their morning routine. And I just, as we were getting closer to shooting, I realized, okay, I need something in here that shows a kind of a light playfulness. It's a light moment in that story. And so let me see. Yeah, it just kind of naturally evolved in the process of doing it. And it was like, let's have them, in this routine, let's have the big sister clean little sister's face, and let's find a way to make it playful, and let's find a way to make it genuine.
But yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's interesting, like where you as a father, but also as a filmmaker, kind of hybrid. I think in the comparison of the Robert Rodriguez stories that he kind of was starting with a lot of the work that I always think it's funny. I don't have kids myself at this time, but it's like, am I going to become like a lighter person or am I going to become a darker person on that nature? And I'm glad that you were able to keep that going instead of, it's like, oh, but I want things to be hopeful and happy. I mean, it's good to have that. I think your ending kind of has this interesting, like, make it up, as it is. But I think there's this interesting, like, level that I really like what the quality that you're bringing to kind of what your production house is, like Mitchell Street Pictures, and kind of maybe go into that a little bit of like what Mitchell Street was for you and what your what it is for you and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, definitely for me, I think that, with telling stories, through Mitchell Street Pictures, we've really felt like we want every story that we put our time and energy into to be worthwhile to some degree, right? So while I grew up on genre and I love to tell story in the genre realms, we've also as a company worked on other projects that are not exclusively genre. There's an immigration family drama that we worked on, and I think called Collisions, directed by Richard Levine. And so, like, even to an extent, though, that deals with family separation, right? So, in a sense, the key character in that story is dealing with a kind of an end of normalcy or an end of a world sort of a scenario. And so, we definitely feel like we want to put our time and energy into stories that we feel will have an impact. It's probably, sort of the strongest way to frame it. And so with the genre stories, we really have loved trying to tell genre stories with diverse characters. We've really loved sort of exploring cultural themes. And as an example, I do feel like a huge part of The Lost is, can love and memory overcome a virus? So even if the virus is some sort of a biological weapon or something like that, these children are still using, the altar, almost like a Day of the Dead sort of an altar, and this process and this love of trying to save this infected person.
Mhm.
And so we loved being able to do that in this space, is to kind of put a component of our culture or our practices kind of into these types of stories. And everything we've been developing and sort of creating from this, recently especially, has had these components of, diverse characters, cultural themes, kind of social issues, but social issues that are being tackled by, you know sort of morphing this creature or this monster into like a social issue or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the post-apocalyptic, you can say, zombie or infected kind of genre has been. I think Dawn of the Dead. It's one of the original 1978 versions, one of my favorite movies of all time. And it's funny how Romero, though, he clearly is like working in that realm, and himself being someone who I don't know his ethnicity. He's always kind of was always like shadowing, but clearly of of some Latino origin and stuff like that. And then how Night of the Living Dead was always like, it wasn't a political movie. It's like, come on, dude. Like he always was
Yeah.
that like kind
Well,
of thing. So
yeah, and I would agree 100%. Like Dawn of the Dead, the original is definitely one of my favorite films, and it's something that I saw, on VHS. My uncle, my godfather, showed me that movie when I was maybe too young to really watch it, but it really did something to me. And actually, what's really awesome is, and it's cool to geek out on Dawn of the Dead with you, especially knowing that you're a fan of it, is because while, like, you know the SWAT team storming the apartment complex in the beginning and people getting shot and heads blown off and all that, as a kid seeing that was like, oh wow. What really was the most sort of haunting component, in a good way, of that film to me was when Flyboy, near the end of the story, when Flyboy kind of loses it, and it's like, let's just let them take this stuff because we'll be okay, right? And then Flyboy, he can't deal with it, and he's like, it's ours, like they can't have it, they can't take it, and he fires the first shot. Like that moment where Flyboy is like breaking down and like deciding to take that first shot at these bikers that are in the mall and have like basically bursted into their sanctuary and all the what they worked for, that always stuck with me. Like his performance and like those words of like, they can't take it, it's ours, and he's like freaking out. I remember thinking about that. And like for me as a kid, like my brother and I, my older brother, like we, we saw that movie and we'd always be talking about it. And we had our zombie plan, like our escape plan. If zombies ever came, how would we get out of the neighborhood? And could we go on the roof? And could we do this? Like we'd always just be strategizing and, jokingly talking about it. But that always really stuck with me. And it's more about the fact that this character was so obsessed with having it. Like it was ours, we worked for it, we can't share it or nobody can take it, that he lost, he kind of lost himself in that. And so even as a kid, that stuck with me, and that's the component of these stories that I love, is that the real conflict is always human. It's always human dealing with other humans or dealing with our own internals and the way we think about things and the way we process things. And that's why I really loved, Dawn of the Dead. And yes, Night of the Living Dead, obviously having, an African American hero, a very strong, character. And yes, at that time, it was very progressive. But yeah, when I had the opportunity to meet George Romero, several years ago at a Fangoria convention, I gave him a copy of my zombie movie, and I had another copy, and I asked him to sign it, and he's like, "You want me to sign your film?" And I said, "Yes, because if you didn't exist, this film wouldn't exist." And so I have that in my office and stuff. And so like talking to him about that, just having a moment to talk to him of like, he always sort of saw into the future. So even if, what he said is, we casted this actor because he was, even though he was African American, he was just the best actor that we had access to, and we really loved him and we wanted to work with him. But the idea that like the story plays out and the ending of the movie has those photos of like zombies hanging from trees and all these crazy visuals, like there was still something I feel that, he's always had, George Romero always had this ability to sort of see into the future, right? And like Night of the Living Dead having that kind of progressive hero, Dawn of the Dead having this commentary on capitalism and consumption, Day of the Dead having this commentary on the military, and control from like a systematic sort of standpoint.
Masculinity, I think, hits very heavy in Day.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And yeah, and even interestingly enough, Land of the Dead having like a Trump Tower and a Donald Trump like leader or character. It's like he was always looking 20 steps ahead of where we were, I think. And he had this sort of understanding, George Romero had this sort of understanding of like these ailments. And then I'll leave it at like Diary of the Dead and this idea of this kind of communication and instantaneous sharing of video and thoughts and comments. I always loved, I thought that was maybe more underrated. But I think I just love his ability to see that. But again, it comes back to this idea that we as humans are always our worst enemy, not necessarily the zombies or the infection or the creature, but like we are our own worst enemies.
Yeah, I think this is definitely, it's true. I had a chance to meet George as well for Survival, the last one, his last movie.
Okay.
And talk to him. It's interesting, him as an artist, like him and Scorsese shared the same movie, which is interesting because Scorsese's work has always been religious, social, political as well.
Yeah.
But on a subtext of like, first though, entertaining, rock and roll kind of status. So it's interesting, but they were sharing a film called The Tales of Hoffman. The other one was back when you only could rent the reels. And so he was the guy in Pittsburgh renting the reels. And then when he couldn't get it, there was this guy in New York named Scorsese that was always checking it out.
Getting it. Wow.
So they're always sharing this film. And that film is very much into dream imagery. And it's a Powell and Pressburger film, The Red Shoes. And so, but it's interesting. It's his whole you know, even go into the Crazies, and you can go into
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever saw Bruiser, a film that's kind of a rare one where a man wakes up with no face on, and or
No, I
Martin.
didn't. I haven't seen that. That sounds cool.
Martin, it's all these things like the vampire with no teeth, but it's always like an allegory for, for being an other, for being homosexual, to being, and whatnot. And so it's like, he's always, there's always this interesting question they always had about the other or othering of folks. And so it's like, it's a very fascinating thing with him, as a filmmaker. And so it was interesting, like he didn't want to talk political stuff. He just was like, hey, like these are the films. As an artist, I used to ask also when I was in college early on, I would ask, oh, what are your top 5 films? And then that usually broke the ground for like, oh, this artistry of how they chose or what they have. But it's interesting on that level of him and Scorsese kind of in the same line, just literally where they go. Like he's very specifically genre, and then Scorsese kind of in the more mainstream kind of world. But yeah, and I think also Survival, the film that we're interviewing, that's a lot of people have not seen that one. Have you seen Survival of the Dead?
I haven't had a chance to actually catch Survival of the Dead yet. Actually, I know that I think I saw a snippet of it, and I'm definitely going to see it, but I
Yeah,
haven't had a chance to catch it.
it's not the best. I always tell people it's not like, it's Dawn is kind of, because I even think Day has its problems, but I knew that he had like his budget last minute, so he created, like, he just said, let's just throw all the money in the gore, and we'll just figure out this military silo kind of thing. Dawn is, because I think Dario Argento is also the one that really helped out in that end. And if you can go to the mall, Monroeville Mall still has a little shrine still there. You have to kind of find it in outside of Pittsburgh.
Nice. I do want to make a pilgrimage there someday and check it out. I really do.
It's a trip because like it's still the same 2 layers, but everything's kind of changed. And I wonder, like, right now, and I think I went there in 2015 with a friend. We were driving through doing a cross country from New York to California.
Nice.
We got to stop off here because we, like, one of our places to stay was in Pennsylvania on the west side. And and yeah, so it was interesting on that level. But with Survival, it goes down, it's a blood feud, and it's interesting, like it's a couple military characters, the last from Diary, end up on this island, and there's these like 2 Irish farmers, and it's all about about land issues, about blood feud and land issues and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then also which is interesting, he doesn't bring in a lot of animals, but there's like a zombie horse and stuff like that, or an undead horse at one point, which is kind of goofy. But it's also, you're thinking like, okay, even like Earth and its changing tides and what he's kind of going for. And then like, but yeah, it goes back to what you even mentioned with land being like on top of the Trump Tower stuff. Like his main character actually isn't a human anymore. It's one of the undead, it's Big Daddy and stuff like that. And it's like on that kind of that level. And so he was definitely, his pulse was on something that's there. And I think in his existence, and yeah, I think the Crazies, that's a movie I think about a lot more than I think than any other at this time. I recommend folks checking it out. But yeah, it's interesting to see where we're at. I mean, it seemed like you were on the pulse of something before that hand of it. I reflect on also, because I'm working on I shot the short film, which wasn't very politicized, but we shot it at the border. It was a revenge grindhouse film called Matalos, and that was actually my first short film at Another Hole in the Head a few years back. Okay. And it kind of got me in. And then, but when we were filming it, there was a lot of things going on in the town and in the area, and like the history of that. I don't know if you've ever spent any time in the Imperial Valley, just east of San Diego at all, but like the history of like water, how water came to the valley, and how that's like a huge, agricultural spot. So what that means is a big migrant worker area. But on top of that, being predominantly, like controlled by county and local police, but also border patrol, because it's right there. It's Calexico's a small like town next to the big Mexicali.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been through that region. I've been through the region, and just spent just a little bit of time there. But I think that's the thing. It's interesting that you sort of, the way you're sort of bringing it up, because that's something that I do feel just truthfully, that's the thing. So people surviving in circumstances like that, it can be very challenging, especially with limited resources. My mother works a lot with the farm working community of like the Central Valley area, and that's a scenario where it's like, people basically in a sense, they're in a place where they're not regarded, where they're kind of existing in the shadows, but these are people that are working their butts off and sort of helping to feed us and feed the country. And so, I think that a big part of The Lost was this idea of having characters, and you mentioned this in talking about Romero, but who are the other, who are the outsider, because they're in a place where they're not supposed to be there, right? And so, yeah, I've always loved trying to tell those types of stories as well, to tell the story of the other or the outsider. Um, and just in terms of like sort of scenario and atmosphere, like it's funny, because even I've always felt like the film The Revenant,
Hmm.
like that in many ways feels like an apocalyptic story. Like if you just flip the scenario and it was somewhat futuristic, but it was still desolate, and it was still a character who kind of loses the most important thing that they have, and it's like a revenge story. It very much feels like an apocalyptic film, to me personally. And so, and I think that's important, right? Because the environment that you live in, the context of uh, what is normal for you, and what are your kind of what is regular in terms of how you function, right? Are you living in a city where you ride a bus every day and you use your laptop and you do this? Because all of a sudden, if you're taken out of that environment and you're just dropped into a scenario where you don't have those things, and you're now forced to kind of find new means of survival, it's, yeah, like we said earlier, it's a kind of a apocalyptic scenario now.
Yeah. And sort of, and then yeah, who are the gatekeepers? Who are the institutions controlling on that? Or maybe, and that's the thing. It's the questions of like revolution, kind of
Right.
getting into that sort of like both being from the Bay Area, kind of the origins of that. But what do you do in second, third generations, continuing on, where you're building up a community, you're creating with the community, you're living with the community, and not just becoming another institution unto its own, and kind of then again making another apocalypse down the road, kind of thing
Right.
like that. So I
Yeah.
think it's always the question that we have as humans. If your empowerment is that, and kind of on that level, because sometimes people don't think that. They just kind of think, yeah, this is, I just need to catch the train and make the money, and then it'll figure itself out, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's more prevalent. I think 2021 is going to be that big question of like caste systems. I think I've mentioned it's more not, in the sense of, I think most of the world kind of knows the have and have nots, and we've always kind of always built other walls around it. But
Yeah.
yet we're literally like, it's literally just comes down to like the have and have nots kind of thing. And, of course, and something that's the amazing thing about technology and, in filmmaking and storytelling, is able to bring that almost to an immediacy, and not just sort of how I have to develop it years and years and years, and then hopefully someone will, or myself, gets the funding to show this story, and then
Yeah.
at the end, maybe a few other people were working on it as well, and so it's this sort of this interesting, like, level that we have, sort of, that we're kind of in. But is the Lost continuing on at other festivals, or what is the kind of the
Yeah, so we have potentially some festival play coming up in the new year. But I think I'm getting very close to just wanting to just release it publicly. We're trying to find some potential platforms or distribution outlets to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, I mean, we feel like the story is it's ready, right? It's just kind of ready to be shared with people. So I think those are kind of our big goals for it. And I definitely feel like there's a huge part of that story of that film that I feel kind of a weight that I'm sort of in a good way that I want to carry into other projects now, because I feel like there was something. I feel like there was something special about what we were able to create, and I always try to do that. I always try to sort of take, maybe, to be somewhat kind of meta about it, but taking a certain energy from a project and trying to kind of bring it and blend it and give it to the next project.
Mm.
And so I think that's what, that's something we've been doing. I think a part of parts of the Lost from a sort of a setup or a concept, were bits and pieces of other stories that we've been developing over the years. They just kind of found little bits and pieces of them found their way into the Lost, and so we kind of love that ability, like kind of a fairy tale-ish apocalyptic sort of vibe. And so I think that's that kind of energy we're now kind of putting into other stories.
Yeah, I think that's something that's the potential there. And I know you've been working on kind of, is there a feature zombie post-apocalyptic film that you want to tell, or is that something that you feel like The Lost kind of encompasses what you've been trying to tell since your senior thesis kind of?
Yeah, I there is a feature length version of, I think, something that is definitely a component of The Lost, that deals with zombies, but what I really wanted to do with this story is set it very far into the future,
Mhm.
so that it's not like, typically it's like, okay, the world's collapsed and there's fragments of society and it's collapsing or had just collapsed. And
Mhm.
I kept thinking in my head, I want to jump really far into
Mhm.
the future to see what, if what would that normalcy have become, and trying to find sort of almost like a utopia, like how could a utopia exist if human civilization fell and there's small pockets of it that are still alive. And
Mhm.
what if there was one pocket that felt like they finally, after all of our, after centuries upon centuries of failed civilizations, what if one actually got it right? And what if one, no matter the color of their skin or what they believed, was able to find a way of living in harmony together and even among nature? And then what would come along and threaten that?
Mhm.
And so that's something that we've been developing for some years now. That when we created the short film The Lost, we took a little bit of that and sort of injected it into The Lost, right? We took a little bit of this feature concept and just sort of put it in there. And so, yeah, we're hoping that at some point in the future we get an opportunity to sort of create it, but it's definitely something we're excited about.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's something that definitely, I mean, kind of the opening, and I think the stories that we'll be seeing from filmmakers like yourself, expanding. Yeah, and I think it's a great jump to go further ahead. I always say, yeah, it's like for myself, just in, I always say like, well, yeah, you can find the right ways, but when it becomes institution, religion, cult mentality, that's when everything, like, how do you not create that, kind of thing for the greater good, that question, which is, I think, the sort of always the sequel, the progression of society, and then of course, yeah, and then what, I think it's media wise in the last year we've had is actually talking about issues of white supremacy and Black Lives Matter and stuff, and additional to other talking points. But it's been a talking point if you've been around San Francisco State, you've been
Right,
been to
right.
the Bay Area. It's and our relationship, I think, is more to technology. We have questions of, I think, a lot more than just because of something we brought up in AIS a lot was, what you can call it is, oh man, I'm blanking on it right now, but it's digital sovereignty
Hmm.
and digital sovereignty and the questions of, well, there are places that people don't want to be found and stuff like that, and in
Yeah.
tribes and nations that have been affected by Western civilization, that essentially technology represents that to those others, or these stories that are told passed through generations because of genocide and what have you, and that now is sort of that relationship to ours in order to, hey, and especially now with COVID-19, vaccines and whatnot. It's like, what are these, bigger questions that are kind of at hand. So I always feel like this is like, what angle, and it's kind of coming as we have all had it in the last few years, kind of more in the media kind of sense, but these questions that have been around for quite generations kind of thing, and whatnot. So yeah, these are just sort of, like I said, like the longer conversations that we
Yeah.
had kind of thing. But I think it's just like, again, like, it's great to see another Bay Area filmmaker. My heart is in the Bay. I don't know if I always will be here, for various reasons. Living in Los Angeles, I was for several years. I used to call most of my adult life, I lived in LA. I grew up and then I came back to finish school. And but it's interesting to see like what is happening. I was really excited to see your work and what Mitchell Street Pictures is doing specifically in Oakland, where it is a weird thing. Like, we're in the most like genre based, I think, piece of area and land, and questions of, past, present, and future. But yet I don't see a lot of genre filmmakers coming out of the Bay Area, and it's an interesting kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just always loved story, and the beauty of growing up here in Fruitvale and having our roots here in East Oakland, it has just been this idea that, like, I feel privileged that I've had this ability to meet people from various backgrounds, with just very unique experiences, and kind of this becomes this melting pot, and sort of hearing people's stories from Mexico or from Central America, hearing people's stories from Africa, hearing people's stories, from China, from Vietnam, and like all these stories are coming together here in Oakland. And so even as a kid, I always, in meeting new people, kids in school, or just people in the community, people in the neighborhood, like just that opportunity to hear all those life stories. We just earlier talked about kind of my immigration stories or immigrant story. Hearing various origin stories of how people came here to sort of set up a foundation for a family to kind of dream. Like, I've always really appreciated that. And I think when I combine that with the fact that I've always, I grew up loving, again, genre stuff, science fiction and horror and the supernatural. And so being able to kind of combine this idea of wanting to help get voices out there, underrepresented voices very often, but doing it in a way where, okay, I can have a component of science fiction. We can have this component of some sort of a creature or some sort of technology that's, threatening humankind or whatever it could be. I just really enjoy that stuff. Like, I will have to say, I think the genre film that I've watched the most is John Carpenter's The Thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I remember watching that like on, just like endlessly on VHS, like growing up. Like, just that was the one film that I would go back to and watch. And it was something about, that very much has an apocalyptic kind of vibe to it, with this isolation and the paranoia, and seeing like McCready and Childs, like seeing like a black and a white character, like just kind of seeing all that. I just always loved that film. But yeah, growing up though, being a fan of genre, you didn't always get to see people that I didn't get to see people that looked like me or my friends or my family very often on screen in those types of stories. And if I did, we got killed really quickly, or something just would happen. And so I think that that's my intention, is to kind of put, the people that I know, people in the community, people that look and believe in those types of things, to be able to put them in the driver's seat of these stories. And I just feel like, time has with time progressing and advancements being made, like I really love what Jordan Peele has been doing with like Us and with Get Out. So I do feel like there's more room, and there has been. I think I saw Kronos, right? Guillermo del Toro's film, when I was young and when it had just kind of launched. seeing Robert Rodriguez's El Mariachi, like I've had these moments of seeing these glimpses of what's possible, because we get to see it we have that opportunity to see it on a big screen. So I do feel like that I'm working to have just a handprint in this, sort of this tapestry that continues to grow as cinema continues to age and develop, of just trying my best to kind of bring stories to Oakland, to Fruitvale, to the Bay Area, and allowing genre to stand in and to kind of be the backdrop to tell these stories.
Yeah. I think that's very powerful. Thank you for talking about that. It's amazing. Yeah, you grew up in Fruitvale. I grew up in the South Bay, so it was very interesting to see kind of technology, but then also, the being and my own family story of being mostly of immigrants. Like none of my parents were actually born here. They were born on military bases in other parts of the world, but my grandfather's story of who he was and stuff like that. But in addition to that, living pretty much, not understanding what language was kind of told to children kind of growing up. And it's something that I always reflect on quite a bit, especially as I got older and I noticed that what was kind of the othering of people. Like my mom and I lived in these broken down old, kind of similar to the Lost country homes, but they're all, was migrant workers everywhere. But then even seeing in her own, knowing her father's story, but othering herself to others, and then the language that was kind of there. I always say it's like a John Steinbeck story kind of thing, like that on that end. And then in my own reflection as a kid growing up and using language, not knowing what that was, what I was saying, and then just sort of having these moments of, I don't know, maybe because of just being the Bay Area and being able to escape that in some ways. But it's something that I always feel like is just something that I really appreciate about East Bay. But then right next door is Blackhawk, Danville, all these, other, these Trump towers of the Bay Area, kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
And then San Francisco as well. But so it's something I really appreciate, as you said, the collective stories of immigrant, migrant workers, coming from all over the world and being the Bay Area kind of this hub. But then also, putting it into the stories of Fruitvale and what I think is, I always feel like it's a Western kind of word saying untapped, but I think you said putting in the driver's seat on that realm, because everyone sort of, I remember when Blind Spotting and Sorry to Bother You came out, both very good movies, but I always felt Sorry to Bother You, even though people said, oh, it's a little too crazy. I was like, well, to me, it's like, I get more excited for that, for being a Bay Area story, because he's using not just oh, this is Oakland. It's more like, oh, this is Oakland, but also on a futuristic, this is, kind of level. And I was like, this is what I want storytelling to be, more than just sort of oh yeah, this is life. Life sucks. It's hard. It's tough, kind of thing like that kind of thing. I mean, Blind Spotting has their moments of theatrical and poetry, but
yes,
I'm just more fascinated by Boots's stories more.
And that's the thing. I mean, Sorry to Bother You is very much kind of a surreal sci-fi story, and but that's the thing, is that these stories, when I mentioned Jordan Peele's work, obviously I don't mean to not highlight the work of other folks like Boots with Sorry to Bother You, but I loved it when I saw it, because what you're saying, it's it had all those critiques and those commentaries, but it had this fantastical kind of sci-fi vibe to it. And so, I mean, I think I think that's what I'm excited about, is I look to my left and I look to my right, and I can see other filmmakers that come from underrepresented positions, and I won't limit that to just race or ethnicity, but just coming from underrepresented spaces, telling these types of stories. But I just love seeing that. I do love to be able to see those voices and that diversity on screen and behind the camera. And I think that, Oakland, we had Oakland featured in, Black Panther, Ryan Coogler's Black Panther, right? Being able to see this opportunity for filmmakers from the Bay, really representing and kind of holding it down and saying, okay, we're going to bring Oakland into this epic Marvel movie, you know, like that, seeing that on the big screen, I was like, oh man, like, you know, that's the stuff as a kid, that I dreamt about seeing on the screen. And now it's actually on the screen.
Yeah. But I do make the joke about Black Panther because I remember watching Hayward and I was kind of laughing. I was like, that's like Atlanta, but it's saying it's Oakland.
Yeah, no, I had the same thing. I said
cinematic like label of like, yeah. So yeah.
Well, because I had heard people saying, because I was out of the country when Black Panther premiered. I had like the day before I had left, and you know, because Grand Lake Theater is like my, you know, that's my theater. Like I love that. That's the theater I grew up in. And so I know that, you know, they showed it when it premiered and that Ryan Coogler showed up and like introduced the movie. And then I was like, I had heard snippets on social media of like, yeah, Oakland is in the movie. And then you get there and it's like, oh, that's definitely not shot in Oakland. But like the fact that it's supposed to be Oakland at least is a victory. And then maybe the next one will be shot in Oakland, you know.
I've heard, that was before the shutdown really happened, that they were going to shoot some stuff out here.
Oh, cool.
But you got to also be from the Bay. You got to clown on the when they do moments like that. You're like, thanks, but you know, kind of thing.
Well, really, I think even in was that the Godzilla movie that came out a few years back? So not King of the Monsters, but the one
the one where they destroy all of San Francisco.
Yeah, San Francisco didn't destroy it, and it's like there's snippets where it says like Oakland staging area, and you're like, no, that's not Oakland.
Oh, Sonic the Hedgehog that we were just watching. My buddy Josh wrote it, and I was like, oh, I loved how you put San Francisco on Samson and Market, and that clearly was like, yeah, I know, we just put the Transatlantic Building. Just throw background and it's a park in Vancouver somewhere.
Yeah.
It's always interesting the use of it. Planet of the Apes movies, it kind of goes on.
Yeah.
We actually it could touch on something is that shooting in the Bay Area has been very expensive for the industry.
Yeah,
and that's why they've chose. I mean, even full films like, I don't know if you saw Age of Adeline, which is like a period piece in San Francisco.
I did not.
Harrison Ford. It's like a Benjamin Button kind of story of a woman who has an accident up in Marin County, and she can't age at all. Like she's a certain age, but she doesn't look that age. She just looks like Blake Lively the whole time. And the whole film takes place in the Bay Area, but they shot like 4 or 5 plates, and that's it. And then everything like was created in Vancouver, which is on that end.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I want to see. I mean, a part of me personally, a part of me wants to do my part to try to help Oakland and the Bay Area, but Oakland specifically, to, you know, what Robert Rodriguez was able to work with, you know, that collective of filmmakers down in Austin to kind of bring the work there. I feel like I've been trying to do my part to bring projects here when I can. You know, even stuff that like I've helped sort of production coordinate that's not my written work or not my directorial work. Like, oh, you guys could shoot it in Oakland, because realistically, you go to the Oakland Hills and you have, you know, that movie I mentioned, Romero, that sci-fi movie, we shot snippets of it in the Oakland Hills and it looked like this kind of desolate place. So you geographically, you have that as a backdrop, right? You can go over towards the estuary near Alameda and you have this kind of nice aesthetic. There's areas along that estuary. I'm not sure how familiar most people might be of it, but there are areas along the estuary that have like a New England East Coast kind of architecture, and just like in a certain area. Obviously, you go downtown and you have bigger buildings. You come here to Fruitvale and you have like this small sort of community feel. You know, you can go all over the place and get really strong, really nice aesthetics, like really nice visuals. And I'm just talking about Oakland. You know, obviously you could go to San Francisco.
Right down International, you get, you know, plenty of, you know, kind of like that. So
yeah, exactly. Just along International. And so like I think that there's also a lot of energy in Oakland too. I've had the opportunity when I'm not, you know, making a film or just doing production work through our company, to like go and teach film to like at-risk youth or risk that are, you know, in sort of low income areas. And when I've done that opportunity to sort of teach film, you know, very oftentimes I see that young people have, again, especially around here, there's just like this kind of fire in people, and there's this creative energy. And unfortunately, when there are no outlets for it, it can cause or find trouble, and things can happen. And so, when I've had that opportunity, that's certainly something that I always try to convey, is just this idea that like you have every right in this world to tell your story, or to tell the stories that you feel are relevant or important to you. And I think being able to bring production work here, and create work opportunities, to create job opportunities for people, I think that's, to me, that's something that's just, it's an additional goal personally for me that I have. But I just, again, it's a beautiful place. Our weather's nice. Like, I think there's so many things that are offered by the place itself, that I would love to see more films being shot and being created here in Oakland, and the Bay Area in general.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. I think here, thank you, Vincent Cortez, Mitchell Street Pictures, The Lost. Yeah, please come back. We're not too far away from each other. I'm in Berkeley, at least until the early part of 2021. But definitely really appreciate the work that you're doing out there. And I'm Benji Carver. Any Instagram, websites, anything like that you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think folks can certainly check out mitchellstreetpictures.com, right? Just fully spell it out. It's a long URL, but you can sign up. We try to release a newsletter every year that just updates folks on what we're doing. We try to update the site, obviously, as much as we can with new projects. And then Twitter, I haven't been as active, obviously, recently because of 2020 and the pandemic, but
Yeah.
At Mitchell Street Pics, as Mitchell ST Pics. We're on there as well. And we're always trying to post some stuff whenever we're on a set. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much out there. And yeah, I'm Benji Carver. You can find me at Movie Hopping Benji, Instagram, Kid Glove Killer Hour, and also Movie Hopping at Twitter. I came back to Twitter in 2020 because of promoting from Building the Warp Dimension. So I was away from Twitter for like 4 years. Like 2016, I was like, I'm done. I'm out. Instagram, and then Instagram got bought by Facebook. I was like, well, I'll this is my necessary evil kind of thing.
I feel you on that. We have to disconnect ourselves sometimes to really kind of live our best life, I think. So it's a good thing to hear that people take a step back. So yeah. I appreciate it. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I appreciate Another Hole in the Head bringing The Lost in and showcasing it. And I thank you all for all the work you've done.
Yeah. Thanks, Vincent.